Under the scorching sun, the wheelchair jolted to a stop in the middle of the yard. The boy's small shoulders shrank as the glass of water tilted high, ready to crash down. A sharp, hissing shout sliced the air, freezing the atmosphere until it felt suffocating. And in that very moment, the door swung open. The single father returned, witnessing everything. But this was only the beginning of the real nightmare. Before we enter the story, tell me which city you're from, and rate it from 1 to 10 after you hear it. You're useless. You can't even stand up. All you do is weigh everyone down. Vanessa stood facing the wheelchair, holding the glass still misted with cold. Her lips trembled, but her voice struck hard, metallic. Ethan clutched the armrest, his tiny face blurred with tears. He pulled his collar to cover half his cheek, dodging the adult's gaze as if avoiding a slap. The glass lifted from Vanessa's hip, raised high. Sunlight slanted across the rim, flashing like a blade being drawn. The moment hung in the air, tight as drowning. Then the kitchen door clicked. Michael was home earlier than planned, still holding his dust-stained hard hat. He froze at the threshold, eyes locked on Vanessa's raised arm and his son's trembling shoulders. 1, 2 seconds stretched like minutes. Then he barked out a command, harsh and raw as clashing iron. "Stop!" Vanessa flinched, her wrist stuck midair. The water quivered. Ethan shrank deeper into the chair, little hands curled back, nails digging into the fake leather of the armrest. Somewhere, a sparrow startled from the fence, leaving behind a crushing silence. You've got it wrong." Vanessa drew a breath, lowering the glass halfway, forcing a smile. "I was just teaching him. He's stubborn, you know that." Michael didn't answer right away. The dried cement streaks on his sleeves rasped against each other. He loosened his grip on the helmet, stepped closer. Heat from the backyard rose against his face, carrying the smell of PVC and damp soil. He looked at the boy. Ethan's head was bowed, hair stuck to his forehead, nose and tears mixed into glittering salt trails. Each time a voice lifted, his shoulders jerked, a reflex too ingrained. The house slowed, breathing only with the tick-tock of the wall clock. Michael once believed money could fix everything. On the dining table sat a freshly unboxed therapy kit, a physical therapy bill pinned under a fridge magnet, a crammed calendar he often crossed out with "urgent" at sight. He'd come home at noon just to grab some files, thinking he was doing right. Now he realized that right was as thin as the cement dust in his hair. Ethan had once raced through the yard, chasing a ball around the persimmon tree, calling out, "Daddy, Daddy," his voice clear as glass. But after the accident, every loud sound was a hammer. A slammed kitchen door made him blink uncontrollably. A dropped chopstick made him flinch. He hated the hiss of shh, hated even a mocking laugh. On his desk, his unfinished drawing showed only a closed window and a colorless sky. Vanessa, his ex-wife's younger sister, set the glass on the flower bed rim, the touch of glass on cement making a faint sound. She tightened her ponytail, flicking a glance toward the house where her leather bag sat open on a chair, the edge of a gold wallet peeking out. Since moving in under the guise of helping with her nephew, she had rearranged closets, shifted photo frames, griped about groceries, sighed over expenses. Her words smooth, but her brows forever pinched like she owed the world. He spilled the water first. Vanessa pressed on, her voice dropping into false softness. "I only lost my temper because I want him to get better. Children must..." "Enough," Michael cut in quietly, low, but it silenced every excuse. Wind rattled the tin wind chime under the eaves, each note standing alone. Water dripped from the glass down the flower bed wall, soaking into soil, darkening. Ethan inhaled as if choking on a bone, then burst out sobbing, the kind of cry that tore the chest without words. Michael stepped around Vanessa, crouched level with the boy. He reached out, stopped halfway, knuckles pale. That hand had once lifted steel beams, balanced a wall, and now it hovered, not knowing where to land. He pulled a tissue from his pocket, offered it. Ethan didn't lift his head, only tilted slightly to take it with trembling fingertips. Behind him, Vanessa blinked rapidly, exhaling sharp through her nose. "I'm telling you again, I didn't mean." Michael didn't look at her. He looked at the boy, at the drops soaking his shirt, at the faint squeak of the wheelchair when Ethan shivered. Sweat dampened Michael's back. The smells of scorched sun and tears stung together. From the doorway, kitchen light stretched across the tiles. The glass still perched on the flower bed rim, sunlight wavering on its surface. "Ethan," he whispered his son's name. Only breath, not a sentence. The boy gripped the tissue tighter. Each small sob struck Michael's chest like a nail. He knew he had been absent too long, but the words only circled in his head before dissolving into the tick of the clock. No wisdom could save this moment. Only his gaze remained. Slowly, he stood. His eyes met Vanessa's, no sound, no movement, just a look, direct, deep, and cold. The backyard was still hot. The glass sat on the rim of the flower bed. Michael inhaled slowly, his breath dry as sand. "What did you just say to him?" he asked, eyes never leaving Ethan. Vanessa lifted her chin. "The truth. He likes to act for pity. You spoil him too much. That's why he keeps it up. That's enough. I'm here day in and day out. You're the one absent. You see one scene and pass judgment?" He knocked the water over on purpose, then cried like some child actor. Michael glanced past Vanessa's shoulder, saw Ethan's small hands still clutching the crumpled tissue. He swallowed hard. "Go inside. Not in front of him. I have nothing to be ashamed of. Inside, Vanessa." His voice was low but final. Vanessa stiffened for a moment, then turned sharply, her heels tapping against the tiles. The sliding door closed with the thin scrape of metal on its track. Michael sat down. "I'm here, son." Ethan leaned forward, wrapping his arms around his father's arm. The smell of a child's sweat mixed with kitchen smoke. His lips brushed Michael's elbow as he shivered. "I'm scared to stay home with Auntie." Michael stayed silent. He stroked the boy's neck with his rough fingertips. The child's heartbeat thumped wildly beneath his shirt. A flare of light off the glass rim stabbed Michael's eyes. He blinked, and everything blurred into memory. The endless wail of a horn, rain like sheets, the front seat crushed in. The smell of gasoline. He could still feel his wife's hand slip from his in that last moment into a void with no sound. The hospital corridor was cold, white lights glaring. The doctor spoke quickly, firmly, every word heavy. Ethan woke after surgery, his legs motionless as dead wood, and his mother lying forever in another room. On the third day, Vanessa appeared at the door with a large handbag, hair tied neat, coat scented with fabric softener. "I'll stay. I'll take care of Ethan. You just keep working, don't worry." She cooked porridge, changed the sheets, taped the physical therapy schedule to the fridge. Michael was grateful for her silent busyness, grateful for another voice in the house. He overlooked her habit of rearranging his wife's altar, overlooked the frowns when he came home late. "I just want things neat," she said. He believed her. Gratitude plastered over the cracks, back to the present. The sliding door opened. Vanessa leaned against the frame, arms crossed, her voice steady. "You heard him. He knows how to cling." Michael looked up. "Step out front for a while. I don't want to argue here." "Fine, but let's be clear. I won't live under suspicion in this house." She brushed past him, shoulder grazing his as she walked straight ahead. Michael lifted Ethan gently into his chair, handed him a fresh glass of water. The boy sipped in tiny gulps, eyes fixed on his father's shirt. They stepped onto the porch, wooden fence on the left, Sarah's house beyond. Sarah, the retired nurse, was watering her rose trellis. Seeing them, she shut off the hose, leaning on her spade. "Something wrong, Michael?" "It's fine, Mrs. Sarah," Michael said. She glanced through the glass door where Vanessa's shadow moved back and forth. She lowered her voice, stepping closer. "I've heard the arguments more than once. Even last week." Her voice was sharp. The boy cried. "If you need someone to sit with him, just knock. I'm home all day." Michael nodded, throat tightening. "Thank you." A phone buzzed inside. Vanessa answered as she entered the kitchen. Michael caught fragments. "Yes, Mom. He's asleep." "No, another time for him to talk. My hands are full." "Grace," he guessed. Vanessa's mother, Ethan's grandmother. Such calls always ended quickly. At first he blamed time zones, meal times. Now those laters stacked in his mind like thin papers. Sarah had gone inside. The wind chime lingered on the porch. Michael turned back to his son, pulled the chair into the shade. Ethan whispered, "Auntie hangs up on Grandma a lot. Says she's a bother. Tells me not to whine." Michael closed his eyes a moment. Fragments fell into place. The landline often unplugged. His wife's photo shifted to a lower shelf. Ethan's toys disappearing, then reappearing in odd places. Every time Michael said, "Let's call Grandma," Vanessa would smirk. "I'll tell her later, quicker that way." Vanessa stepped back onto the porch, her smile thin as paper's edge. Mom was checking in. "I told her everything's fine. Do you have more to say?" "Yes. Tonight I'll be home. Tomorrow too." I can arrange my schedule. You mean I should leave? I mean things need to be clear. Silence spread across the porch, spilling down the steps. Vanessa pressed her lips tight, turned inside. This time, her heels clicked softer, deliberately. Michael lifted Ethan, carried him into the living room. He set the boy near the window, pulled the curtain halfway up. Afternoon light hung thin, dust drifting like fine rain. On the table, the therapy schedule showed scribbles crossed out and rewritten in another color. He touched the smeared ink, still damp. Ethan looked up. "Dad, are you going to work tomorrow? I'll be home with you." The boy exhaled as though dropping a stone. Michael scanned the room, the landline, the medicine cabinet, the photos. He realized how much he had overlooked. The midday clicks of locks, the repeated, "Don't worry," the postponed calls, the red veins in Ethan's eyes after each lesson. All of it sat there, plain, while he had walked through like a blind man staring ahead. Ethan sat on the bed, propped on pillows, wheels brushing the cabinet. The window cracked open, dust swirling slow as a school of fish. He looked at the crutches in the corner, remembering hot noons when Vanessa dragged him into the yard. Stand, up, no leaning. Her hands cold and strong, lifting then letting go. His knees trembled, eyes burning with sunlight. When he collapsed, she sighed. Dead weight. Some days, she wheeled him into the sun, for the bones, then left for the kitchen. He sat, face up, sweat trickling into his ears, ants crawling across the tiles. He wanted to call Auntie, but the word jammed behind his teeth. He feared the shouting, yet craved a single good job until it ached. The door creaked open. Michael peeked in, asking with his eyes. Ethan nodded. He set a glass of milk on the table, paused at the sight of the crutches. "You okay?" "I'm okay." Michael pulled the blanket up to the boy's waist, started to speak, then stopped. When he left, Ethan touched the rim of the glass for warmth. He thought of his mother, of her voice light as leaves. The image flickered past, leaving emptiness in his chest. That night, Michael got a call from the site. Steel beams delayed. He grabbed his keys, told Vanessa, "I'll be out a bit." The night had fallen, damp earth rising from the flower bed. He finished the errand, came back later than planned. Lights were dim, only a strip of yellow spilling from Ethan's room into the hall. Michael set his hand on the doorknob, then froze. Vanessa's voice slipped through the crack. "Don't fake tiredness. Stand. Don't lean on that chair." Ethan's voice, thin as paper. "It hurts. Hurts because you're lazy. Want pity, huh? Cut the act. Dead weight." The last word cracked against the wall and bounced back into Michael's ears. He stood close to the wall, fingers clenched into a fist. The muscles under his shoulder throbbed. He wanted to open the door, to snatch his boy into his arms, to throw that voice out into the yard. But he heard the clatter of crutches against wood, the broken rhythm of his son's breathing. He stepped back, like a builder spotting a crack in a concrete pillar. It's failing, but to take it apart, you need scaffolding. Open the door now, and everything would collapse. He drew a breath, pulled out his phone, pressed record long enough to capture a few seconds of meaningless noise, then shut it off. The door quivered softly. Then came Vanessa's muttered curse, heavy with frustration. The next morning, while Vanessa was out at the market, Michael called Grace. "This is Michael. We need to talk." There was half a beat of silence on the line. Then her voice, husky and warm. "Is something wrong with Ethan?" They met at a small corner cafe, table by the window, the ceiling fan whirring overhead. Michael laid it out plainly. No additions, no flourishes. Grace folded her hands, knuckles sharp beneath her skin. "My daughter," she broke off, eyes downcast. "She's stubborn, but she isn't cruel. When she holds things in, she ends up hurting others without realizing. Ethan is my grandson. Don't let another scar land on him. You need to act before it's too late. If testimony is what you need, I'll say it. She often stops me from speaking with the boy. I need the truth. Truth doesn't wait. Call me when you talk to her." That afternoon, clouds thickened. Sarah knocked, blunt as ever. "Michael, if you don't protect your boy, one day it'll be worse than a glass of water." He stood in the doorway, hands still dusted with the job site. "I know. I've seen it before. In hospitals, in other homes. At first, the signs look like discipline. They're not. I live right next door. I hear." Ethan's door cracked open. He peeked out, eyes slightly swollen. Sarah nodded to him, her smile a brief flicker of sunlight before it faded. She stepped back, letting Michael close the door. Night fell. Michael sat beside his son's bed. Ethan slept on his side, hair matted to his forehead, hand resting loosely on the blanket. Michael reached out, took that small hand. The boy's fingers curled instinctively, warm and light. Outside, the wind chime sounded now and then, thin and lonely. Inside, the clock beat its rhythm. Michael looked at his son's face under the glow of the desk lamp, thought of the crack running through the glass, through the shouts of the night before, through the cut-off phone calls. He tightened his grip, as if anchoring a rope. "I'm here," he whispered, though the boy didn't hear. He didn't make grand promises. He only made one vow to himself, to uncover the truth to the very end, piece by piece, and place his son on the safe side of every choice. The darkness beyond the door thickened. Inside, Ethan's breathing was steady, straight as a line of chalk. Michael sat right there, waiting for daylight. The next morning, when Vanessa handed him a shopping list and left for the market, Michael sat at the dining table. He opened the mailbox, pulled out a stack of bills, hospital, physical therapy, Ethan's medical subsidy. The numbers repeated month after month, but tucked among them were odd charges: a hair salon, an online handbag order, a gift card from the mall, transaction notes tagged with subsidy withdrawals. He traced each line, jaw pressed tight. Some entries for child patient transport had been switched to ride, hailing receipts, destinations at beauty stores. He stacked the receipts separately, slid them into an envelope. That afternoon, he set up 2 tiny cameras disguised as chargers, one plugged near the living room bookshelf, one hidden in a potted plant out back, the lens buried behind plastic leaves. The power cords ran neatly under trim. Ethan watched him. "Dad, fixing the wiring?" "Yeah, just making sure it doesn't short out. Don't touch them, okay?" Ethan nodded, half understanding, half not. By the third day, the sky blazed clear. Michael left for work early but kept his phone set for motion alerts. Near noon, the screen buzzed. The backyard feed shook into view. Vanessa stood before the wheelchair. "Look at this mess." She flung her hand. The rag dropped to the ground, spilled water, and just sitting there. Ethan muttered, "I didn't mean to. Always. Didn't mean to." She snatched up a plastic bottle, slammed it down on the ground, water splashing against the boy's knees. Sunlight flared off the rim, blinding. Vanessa leaned close, dead weight. The boy hunched his shoulders, lips pressed tight. She shoved the wheelchair back hard, wheels scraping the step. The image jittered in ragged bursts. Michael stood at the worksite, hand gripping until the bones whitened. He didn't call home. He let the camera do its job. That night, he replayed everything, frame by frame, slowing, pausing, taking screenshots. In the living room, another clip. Vanessa swept up school books, slammed them onto the table when she saw smudged ink. The cup in her hand wobbled. Ethan ducked, voice barely air. "I'm sorry." Michael froze another frame, slid it into the envelope with the bills. The next morning, he went to Ethan's school. The homeroom teacher, ink stains still on her fingers, invited him into the small nurse's office beside the main office. "Lately, Ethan startles when I raise my voice," she said softly. "One day he came with a bruise on his wrist. I asked. He said he fell. It's happened more than once. He studies well, but he's afraid of contact." Michael nodded, throat constricted. "If you need confirmation." She handed him a sheet recording each visit Ethan made to the nurse's office. "These are the dates I logged." That afternoon, the whispers spread quietly over the fence. Sarah stopped by, left a bag of pastries in the kitchen. "We've heard. All of us. The shouting, the crashing sounds. I don't like stepping into another family's matters, but this is no longer private." Michael said only, "I'm grateful." She looked out the window toward the backyard, where the potted plant with the hidden camera stood still. "Be careful. She's not foolish." Indeed, in the days that followed, Vanessa began glancing around as she walked from the kitchen to the living room. She shifted picture frames, moved a potted plant a little. When she noticed Michael spending more time at home, she smirked. "Worksite slowing down?" "Yeah. Why are you looking at me?" "I'm not." The air in the house was thick, like paint that hadn't dried. Ethan shrank into himself, dragging a thin blanket everywhere he went. Michael still joked with his son, still cooked dinner, still asked about homework. Inside, a slow fire burned. One evening, Vanessa set her purse on the table, opened her phone. Her eyes paused for half a second on the outlet near the bookshelf, narrowing. This outlet new? Yeah, had it replaced the other day. She let it go, but from then on her steps were slower, her eyes sweeping the corners. Michael knew she sensed something, but he didn't back down. When the time was right, he called Grace and Sarah over. They sat in the living room, only the table lamp lit. Michael placed the laptop on the table and hit play. On the screen, Vanessa in the backyard, shouting. The water bottle slammed down. The words, "dead weight," stabbing like needles. Ethan's face frozen. Sarah pressed a hand to her chest, breath-catching. Grace went pale, her lips trembling. "Oh God, my daughter, she..." Michael switched to another clip. Book slammed onto the table, a cup rattling. The child's timid apology. No one spoke. Only the wind chime outside tapped a lonely note. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "That settles it." Grace clenched the corner of her handkerchief, eyes brimming. "Michael, do what needs to be done. Don't let her near that boy another day." Michael closed the laptop, slid the memory card into an envelope with the receipts and the teacher's notes. He stood, looked at the two women, then toward Ethan's room. It's time to bring her into the light. That afternoon, heavy clouds pressed low over the roof. Michael placed the envelope and the laptop on the living room table, pulled out a chair across from him. "Sit down, Vanessa." She tossed her keys onto the table, folded her arms, smirked. "Another lecture?" Michael opened the video. The backyard appeared, her voice shouting. The water bottle slammed, dead weight cutting the air. Then the living room scene. Book slammed down, Ethan's small hand shrinking back. Then the stack of receipts, medical subsidies drained into beauty stores and gift cards. Vanessa shot to her feet, the chair screeching. "You spying on me? I'm protecting my son." "Your son?" She laughed harshly, eyes reddening. "He's the one who dragged my life into the gutter. You brought home a cripple, forced me to raise him, breathe hospital air, listen to the crying at night. It's all because of you." The last words burst into a scream. Ethan, in his room listening to an audiobook, had the door cracked open enough to catch the words. He wheeled himself shakily to the doorway, his face drained of color. "Auntie, I didn't." "Shut up." Vanessa flung her hand toward him as if swatting a cat. The boy shrieked, tears spilling. Michael stepped in front of his son, his voice dropping low. "That's enough." The noise carried through the wall. Next door, Sarah set down her watering can and dialed. "They're shouting at the house next to number 17. There's a child inside," she told the dispatcher plainly. In the living room, Vanessa kept raging. "What do you want? To humiliate me in front of the neighbors? Give me back the years I lost. These bills were paid with Ethan's subsidy." Michael pointed to the receipts and the bruises, the words he had to hear. "I won't let it go on." A knock, then the doorbell. Sarah entered with a man in a dark jacket. Nameplate, Detective Paul Rogers. A uniformed officer followed. "We received a report," Rogers said evenly. "Who's the homeowner?" "I am." "Michael, this is my son, and this is Vanessa. Anyone injured? Need medical attention?" "No," Michael answered, his hand still on Ethan's shoulder. "But I have evidence of abuse and misuse of funds." He opened the laptop, handed over the memory card, laid down the envelope of receipts. Sarah stood behind him, stern-faced. Grace arrived, breathless, bracing herself with one hand on the table. "I'm Vanessa's mother," she said. "I'm willing to testify. She blocked me many times from speaking to my grandson, and here are her signatures on transfers she claimed were for the boy's transport, but went straight to beauty stores." Rogers pulled on gloves, skimmed the footage. His face didn't change. He asked Ethan a few gentle questions, took notes. "Are you afraid, son?" Ethan nodded, eyes lowered. Michael squeezed his shoulder gently. "We'll proceed by the book," Rogers said at last. "Mrs. Vanessa, please cooperate." "Cooperate with what? It's all lies." Vanessa lunged, reaching for the laptop. The officer stepped in, twisted her arms behind her back. The cuffs snapped shut with a dry click. Neighbors peeked from their gates. Sarah stood tall, silent. Grace covered half her face with a handkerchief, eyes unfocused. Vanessa thrashed, her shoes pounding the floor. "Let me go. No one wants to raise a useless cripple. He'll always be dead weight to you." "Michael." Her words sliced through the hallway like blades. Ethan flinched as if cut, breaking into sobs. Michael turned, clutching his son tight. "No, son," he whispered into the boy's ear. Every word nailed firm. "You are everything to me." Ethan buried his face in his chest. his small shoulders trembling in broken waves. His breath rushed hot and ragged through Michael's shirt. Michael held him tighter, one hand shielding his eyes, blocking every shard. Rogers signaled to the officer. Vanessa was led out the door, blue and red flashes from the cruiser painting her face in harsh splinters. She still turned her head, spitting venom, but her words drowned beneath radio chatter and neighbors' whispers. The car door slammed shut, cold and final. The living room emptied of noise. Sarah placed a hand briefly on Michael's back, then stepped away. "Breathe, both of you. I'll make some tea." Grace stood nearby, eyes wet, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry, Michael, and I'm sorry, dear boy." Michael only shook his head. He sank onto the sofa, Ethan curled against him like a small bird that had just weathered a storm. On the table, the envelope lay open, receipts spilling at the edge. The laptop screen was black, reflecting a blank patch of ceiling. Outside on the porch, the police car rolled away. The engine faded into the distance. The house still carried the smell of PVC pipes and warm milk. Michael smoothed his son's hair, felt the back of his hand damp with tears. He kissed the boy's crown, staying silent for a long time. Beside him, Sarah set down the tray of tea with care. Grace sat on the edge of the chair, breathing hard before steadying herself. Outside the window, the sky had turned grayer, rain drumming softly on the tin roof. Michael looked at the child in his arms, saw the boy's eyelids grow heavy, sobs fading into even breaths. He wiped his own cheek, leaned his head back against the sofa. His throat burned raw, but within the sound of rain, he heard something else. No more shouting, no more objects slammed. He knew the fight wasn't over. Paperwork, lawyers, therapy, long nights. But tonight, the house had one less shadow pressing it down. He pulled the blanket over his son, rested his forehead against the boy's warm temple. Tears slid over the bridge of his nose, slow and certain. This was only the beginning of healing, and he would walk it through, step by step, never letting go of his son's hand. The first night after Vanessa was taken away, Ethan slept fitfully. From time to time, he jolted awake, eyes wide in the dark, reaching for Michael's arm. "Dad, don't leave me alone. I'm here." Rain tapped gently on the tin roof. Next door, someone dropped a glass. The crash split the hallway like a knife. Ethan flinched, clutching his head, gasping. Michael pulled him tight against his chest, his own heart hammering to the boy's rhythm. Even after Ethan fell back asleep, Michael lay awake, watching the nightlight cast its weary glow across the ceiling. By day, the startles still stalked him. The boy would be coloring, and a quarrel rose in the alley. He'd drop the crayon, slide into the corner of the chair. Michael moved through the house like a man in a hospital ward, closing doors silently, setting cups down with both hands, silencing the phone. He gathered all the glassware into a high cabinet, replaced it with plastic cups. Each time Ethan's shoulders jerked, Michael felt his own throat stab as if caught on bone. The words, "if only," stuck behind his teeth. Grace came in the afternoon, carrying a bag of cookies. She saw the circles under their eyes, sat down with her hands folded. "Michael, there's something I should have said sooner." He poured the tea, waited. "Back when my sister was still alive, she told me Vanessa was always prying, jealous. Not about money, a kind of life jealousy. She said once Vanessa pounded on her door, crying, saying, 'You're always the one people love.' I told her to see a counselor. She went a few times, then quit. Then the accident happened. Everything unfinished." Grace sighed, her eyes fixed on the table's edge. "I thought time would mend it. But maybe it only dug in deeper." Michael remembered old evenings, his wife laughing by the sink, Vanessa sitting apart, silent, watching. The little gifts Vanessa once bought Ethan, in truth, they were the very things his wife had liked. A cold line traced his spine. That cruelty had not only been greed or control, it had been fed by something darker, more enduring. "Thank you," he said quietly. Grace touched the back of his hand, her voice low. "Don't blame yourself to the bone. Take care of that boy." That night, Michael checked the locks more carefully than ever. He slid the bolts, turned the deadlocks twice, added rubber pads to the doorframe so it wouldn't slam. Ethan lay sideways with a picture book, glancing at the door every so often. "Dad, the door's locked, right?" "Locked. No one's coming in." The boy nodded, pulled the blanket up, his breathing steadying. Late night, wind wound through the porch trellis, the chime clinking in broken notes. Michael shifted on the sofa, half dozing, when he caught a faint rustle out front. like a foot brushing the grass. He sat up, moved to the window, eased the curtain. In the dim streetlight, the rose trellis lay crushed on one side, petals scattered like drops of blood. The wooden gate hung ajar, latch dangling. He tilted his head, listening. Nothing but insects. Michael opened the door, stepped onto the porch. The smell of trampled earth rose, mixed with a faint trace of perfume, Vanessa's brand, the one that clung to her scarves and collars. At dawn, Michael called Detective Paul Rogers. "I need an emergency protection order for Ethan." His voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "I'm afraid she'll come back." Rogers answered steadily. "Understood. Be at the station by 9. Bring the videos, receipts, and the teacher's statement. We'll take it from there." While waiting, Michael installed extra alarms, a magnetic door sensor, motion detectors on the porch, each device fixed as carefully as laying brick. Out back, he swapped the potted plant camera for another, shifted the angle. Ethan sat in his chair, watching, fingers twisting the hoodie drawstring. "It'll go off loud if the door opens," Michael said. "You hear it. You call me right away." "Okay," Ethan whispered. At the station, Rogers walked him through the process. A female officer read the file, asked a few short questions. Michael signed. By noon, he held the temporary order as if clutching a thin guardrail between two lanes of traffic. That afternoon, Michael's phone buzzed again and again. An unknown number. He answered. A smooth male voice introduced himself as Vanessa's attorney. "My client claims you're emotionally abusing the child," the voice droned, pressuring him. "Fabricating stories to seize custody. We filed a new psychological evaluation. Ethan has not been abused at home, and all subsidy spending went to medical use." "What evaluation?" Michael's voice was cold. "A copy with a private clinic's seal. You'll receive it shortly." By evening, the envelope arrived. Inside, a report with a strange signature, a blurred seal. The expense items listed: rehab equipment, home therapy services, eerily matching the charges at beauty stores. Michael placed the sheets side by side, studied the identical fonts. The thought flashed sharp. This is forged. The news leaked faster than he imagined. A local site ran the headline, "Custody Dispute. Aunt accused of abuse calls it slander." The article used a blurred photo of Michael holding Ethan the night police came, with a vague caption, "Sources say the father tends to dramatize." At the school gate, some parents whispered. An anonymous text pinged his phone. "Stop using your kid for sympathy." Michael read, deleted, his fingers trembling, heart pounding like a hammer. Sarah came over with a stack of printouts. "I saved the supportive comments," she said, "but there are people who don't understand. Don't read the rest." "I'm fine," Michael said, though his eyes were swollen. Grace arrived later, resting her hand on his shoulder. "She's hired a strong lawyer, but forged papers are still forged. I'll contact the old clinic, ask them to verify the real records. Hold steady." That night, rain came again. Ethan curled under the blanket, ears straining at every sound. The door alarm gave a soft tick when the wind nudged it, and he flinched. Michael sat beside him, arm wrapped around his back. "They're saying bad things about you online," Ethan whispered. "They say I'm not even scared. You don't need to read it. Your job is to sleep well. My job is to set everything right." The next day, Rogers called. "I've forwarded the protection order to the court. They'll review it for extension. As for those medical documents, we're checking the seal and license numbers. Don't respond to the press." "I'll stay quiet," Michael answered. "But you know, people are starting to look at my house like it's a glass cage. Hold steady. Truth takes time." Late that night, a group of strangers walked past the gate, whispering, pointing at the cameras. One raised a phone, the click of photos sharp in the drizzle. Michael pulled the curtains, heart tightening. He understood the dirty trick. Make noise, cause chaos, drag him off course. But the storm wasn't just outside the gate. Vanessa's lawyer sent another letter, accusing him in return. "Mr. Michael has deliberately isolated my client from the child, incited the neighbors, and manufactured one-sided evidence." At the bottom was an offer to settle quietly, for the child's best interest. Michael crumpled the printout, then smoothed it flat again. He knew every move now was a trap. Lose his temper, and he'd lose. In the stillness of midnight, Michael stepped into Ethan's room, found the boy still awake, staring at the ceiling. He lay down beside him, pulled up the blanket. "Dad, what if Auntie calls me a burden again?" Michael turned. set his hand on the boy's chest, steadying his breath. "No one has the right to call you that. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." Ethan blinked, lashes brushing the dark. Outside the window, the rain had stopped, but the wet street reflected the yellow streetlight in long streaks. Inside the house, there were more cameras, more alarms, more files. Yet what Michael clung to in that moment was the small hand resting in his own. He closed his eyes, holding on to his words like a stake driven into swirling water. Outside, the public remained divided, the news murky. Inside, he forged a silent, solid resolve, ready for the next round of the fight. In the morning therapy session, Ethan sat on the green mat, arms hugging a soft ball. The therapist said, "Try breathing with my hand now. 4 counts in, 4 counts out." Through the glass, Grace and Sarah stood waiting. Sarah waved, gave a thumbs up. Ethan looked over, lips twitching as if debating. He followed along, his shoulders lowering a little. After the talk, he moved into the sports area for disabled children. The coach lowered the hoop, handed him a light sports wheelchair. "Push twice, turn left." "Good." The ball bounced off the backboard, dropped plunk into the net. Ethan froze for a second, then smiled a clean smile, unforced. Sarah sniffled as if dust had caught her nose. Grace dabbed her eyes, whispering, "See? Your boy knows how to smile again." That afternoon, Michael's phone buzzed with an unknown number. A husky female voice, firm. "I'm Whitaker. I taught Vanessa in high school. I work now at the county social center. I read the news and I think you need to know a few things." They met at a small cafe near the welfare building. Mrs. Whitaker was in her 50s, hair neatly pinned, coat worn but clean. She set a thin envelope on the table, not sliding it toward him. "I didn't bring agency files, but I can testify. Back in school, Vanessa used glue traps to catch birds, and once tied firecrackers to a stray cat's box. The school called her parents. Psychological reports recommended close monitoring. The family asked to handle it privately. The file was buried." Michael gripped his paper cup. "Will you testify for me in court? I'll speak to what I saw and the records we filed." And here, she handed him a handwritten list, some old contacts. A former doormate, a co-worker from a grocery store. Vanessa borrowed money, used names, then disappeared. They're willing to talk. That evening, Grace came home with a heavy face. "Today I filed supplemental papers at court. Passing the cafe across the street, I saw Vanessa with a man wearing a courthouse club badge. They spoke quietly, but I caught words like video, erase marks, costs. You're sure?" "No mistake. He's the nephew of a friend from my church group, works as a records clerk." Michael called Rogers immediately. They met at the station. Rogers spread a map of the courthouse, pointed at several public cameras. "If she tries to tamper with evidence, we'll catch it. But we need legal bait." Michael nodded. "Use Mrs. Whitaker's list. Call them in for statements. I'll reach out. Invite them to recount what happened. And if Vanessa meets that clerk again, I could—" "No," Rogers cut him short. "You don't confront her directly. You just give us your and Ethan's schedules, so we can guess when she has free time." The next day, Michael called the names on the list one by one. A young woman named Riley told him over the phone. "She used my ID to open a phone account, then vanished. When they traced it, she claimed I'd done it. I still have the messages." A man named Ben said, "Vanessa pitched in charity cosmetics investment, pooled money from the group, then ran. I've still got the wire receipts." At school, after practice, Ethan sat with a sandwich. Sarah slid him a carton of milk. "You know," she said casually, "like any neighbor chatting, adults make mistakes sometimes. But some adults fix them. We choose which side we stand on." Ethan chewed slowly, looked up. "I want to stand on Dad's side." Sarah chuckled softly. "Then you're strong enough already." That afternoon, Grace brought a slip of paper. The clerk's name and his shift schedule, passed along by a church friend. Rogers accepted it, nodding. "We'll request an environmental recording order around the courthouse. If she mentions erasing videos, we'll have both audio and visual." Michael asked, "And the public opinion?" "The papers keep running stories. The more original evidence we secure, the quieter they'll get," Rogers replied, eyes on the notes. "Your job is keeping Ethan safe and continuing therapy." Night came. Ethan wheeled himself to the balcony, ran his fingers along the rim of his newly pumped tires, whispered, "Tomorrow I want to shoot more baskets. Yeah, I'll stand under the hoop, grab the rebounds." Ethan laughed. The sound was thin, but it stood firm on the porch. On the appointed day, Rogers set 2 surveillance teams. Michael took Ethan to the center, then returned home, phone line open. From Rogers's radio came clipped reports. Target leaving cafe, heading east entrance. Man with badge alongside. They're in the parking area, stopping near the camera maintenance pole. Michael stood in the kitchen, fingers drumming the tabletop unconsciously. Outside, the wind chime struck 3 notes. An hour later, Rogers called. We got it. Part of the conversation mentioned money in exchange for deleting the original files. They set another meeting for Friday night. We've already secured an extended warrant. What can I do? Call the people on Mrs. Whitaker's list. Tomorrow they'll come to the station to sign statements and hand over electronic evidence. We'll lock every dark piece into the same file. Michael hung up, exhaled long. Ethan had just come home, face flushed from practice. He held up the ball proudly. I made 5 shots today. My hero. The boy laughed, pressed the ball to his cheek, leaving a round mark. Night fell quickly. Sarah hung another solar lamp on the porch, its golden light spilling like honey. Grace rinsed strawberries in the kitchen, the sweet tart scent warming the house. Michael looked around. The cameras blinked. The sensors stayed quiet. Unease was still there, but now it was crowded out by something else. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Late that night, Rogers called again, voice steady and deep. Michael, next time she shows up, we'll end this. The night held its breath. The door sensor clicked. The alarm gave a faint buzz. Michael shot up, hand already on the switch. The front door slammed open, wind rattling the chimes. Vanessa stormed in, hair wild, eyes bloodshot. Her gaze swept the living room, and she smashed a picture frame to the floor, glass shattering wide. Bring the boy out. Bring Ethan here so I can teach him. Michael stood firm between the hallway and his son's room, his voice flat. Stop, Vanessa. Leave this house now. Move, she screamed, yanking a drawer open, spilling it. I've had enough. I'll make him obey me. The porch light outside the gate flickered. A shadow shifted. Michael glanced at the tiny red dot on the bookshelf camera live streaming to the cloud, as arranged with Rogers. He spoke each word clearly, loud enough for the mic. You are violating a temporary protection order. Vanessa froze for a beat, then sneered. Order? No order can hold my life together. She hurled a vase against the wall, shards sprang across the carpet. Ethan's door cracked open. The boy peeked out, eyes wide with fear. Ethan, close the door, Michael said without turning. Vanessa stepped closer, breathing hard. She jabbed a finger into Michael's chest, her voice breaking. I was supposed to have it all. Not my sister, not that crippled kid. The insult cut like a blade. Through the earpiece in his jacket, Michael heard Rogers's clipped whisper, We've got picture and sound. Keep her talking. Michael didn't reply, only shifted slightly to keep her in the frame. Vanessa kept spewing venom, the pieces spilling out. I had to watch him every day. Every cry kept me awake. He spilled. I cleaned. I taught him and you call it abuse? Yes, I shouted. I hit him a few times, so what? Did he learn or not? Inside the room, Ethan trembled, hands clawing the armrest. He pushed the door open wider, wheeled into the hall. The chair's wheels squeaked softly against the carpet. Vanessa spun, eyes narrowing. Come here. Look at me. Ethan stopped, chin quivering. Michael laid a hand on the back of the chair, anchoring him. The boy inhaled, lips pressed once. Then he lifted his head, voice hoarse but steady. You're wrong. I'm not useless. I have my dad, my grandma, and people who love me. The house sank into silence, like after a lightning strike. Michael felt his throat tighten. The short words knocked a weight loose in his chest. He blinked, eyes burning with moisture. Vanessa reeled as if slapped, her face twisting. You dare talk back. She lunged for the child. Michael turned, shielded Ethan in his arms, sliding the wheelchair back half a turn. At that instant, the front door burst open again. Police. Rogers' voice rang sharp. Mrs. Vanessa, stop. Hands up. Vanessa spun, lunging for a floor lamp as if it were a last lifeline. Rogers and 2 officers closed in. She thrashed, feet kicking, mouth spitting venom. You set me up. That camera. I didn't say a thing. You said enough, Rogers answered, eyes locked on her. Everything has been recorded. Neighbors spilled onto porches. Sarah stood at the gate, hand pressed to her chest, face set hard. Grace rushed from the kitchen, froze in the beam of lights, lips trembling but eyes clear. Vanessa struggled another beat, the lamp slipping from her grasp, crashing down. Her wrists were pinned, cuffs snapping shut with a dry click that ended the story. "You all right?" Rogers glanced quickly at Michael. "I'm all right," Michael nodded, arms still wrapped around Ethan. Vanessa was led out the door. She twisted, shouting hollow words into the air. Outside, cruiser lights strobed blue and red, washing over the facades, flooding the whole street in cold light. Neighbors peered from gates, none speaking. Ethan still shook, but his eyes never left the figure being taken away. He clutched Michael's sleeve, fingers cold warming slowly. "You did so well," Michael whispered, voice breaking. "So well." The boy nodded slightly, inhaled deep, like the first breath stepping onto the court. At the doorway, Rogers turned back. "Camera feed is live. Her confession is plain as day. Tomorrow morning, we'll file the custody report and recommend charges." Michael only nodded. He pulled a blanket over his son's legs, wiped the tear shining on his chin. On the floor, shards of glass from the frame reflected the spinning blue and red. Sarah stepped inside, quietly sweeping them up, her movements brisk, as if clearing away a long-stuck odor. The police car door slammed shut. The siren wailed, carrying down the block, then faded into the night. Michael stood in the doorway, holding Ethan a little tighter. Out front, the rose trellis trembled in the breeze. The night felt like swallowing a stone cold and slick, but here, in the doorway, was the warmth of a single, certain phrase, "I have my dad." And everyone who heard it tonight knew that it had won. On Sunday morning, the county gym opened early. Ethan sat in his sports wheelchair, gloves strapped tight on the rims. The coach blew the whistle. Left pass, off the board. The ball left his hands, smacked the backboard, then dropped clean into the hoop. The kids let out a soft, "Yeah." Ethan wheeled around the curve, sweat beading at his nape. His eyes lit as if a shaft of sunlight had just struck them. From the bleachers, Michael raised his hand in the sign for, "Good job." Sarah clapped softly. Grace smiled. And Linda, the center's volunteer, stood by the scoreboard, adding another mark for the team. That afternoon, Michael packed up his construction site laptop, reset his phone to emergencies only. He sliced fruit, brewed tea for Grace, stopped by the center to check in with new parents. In the kitchen corner, Sarah arranged boxes of cookies to bring to therapy class the next morning. The house, after the storm, carried small sounds clearly. A spoon tapping a dish, footsteps light across the hall. Ethan stretched out on the carpet, pulling at his legs while telling, "Today I turned sharper. Tomorrow I want to practice shots from the arc." "Linda will keep the time," Michael said. "Turning the stopwatch, I'll be under the hoop to grab the rebounds." As night fell, Sarah knocked on the door, carrying a small wooden box. "This, she gave me to keep a long time ago." Her voice slowed. She said, "When the day truly comes, hand it back. Back then I thought you weren't ready. Now maybe you are." Michael lifted the lid. Inside lay a cream-colored letter, corners worn. The handwriting was familiar, a slight slant. "If one day I am gone, please let our son grow up in love. Never let him believe he is a burden." Michael swallowed hard. He called Ethan over, spread the letter on the table, read every line aloud, not skipping even the ink smudge at the end. When he finished, the room held still for a beat. Ethan looked up, eyes bright yet calm in a way that startled Michael. "I'm not scared anymore. I have a real family now." The boy wrapped his arms around Michael's neck. The smell of child's sweat, old paper, and hot tea mixed together warm enough it ached. Weeks later, the community center hall carried a white banner. The Roselight Fund, supporting children with disabilities. The fund was named after Michael's late wife's favorite flower. Michael, Grace, Sarah, and Linda sat side by side at the long table. Mrs. Whitaker was there too, standing quietly in the back. Neighbors brought small envelopes, baskets of storybooks, a few pairs of training gloves. Michael spoke briefly. "Thank you, everyone. We want to create a place where the children can receive therapy, play sports, find friends, and feel they can look straight at themselves without shame." Grace leaned toward the mic, voice trembling but firm. "My daughter loved roses because they have thorns and still bloom. Let's help the children bloom in their own way." Linda announced the first scholarship, a sports wheelchair for a boy from the next ward. At the ribbon cutting, Ethan held the scissors with both hands. Michael laid his hand over his son's, steadying the blade. With a single snip, the red ribbon fell. Applause rolled thick, bouncing off the walls, rising to the ceiling. Ethan grinned wide, dimples deepening ones unseen for a long time. By late afternoon, the outdoor basketball court glowed honey gold. Sparrows perched on the power lines, hopping one by one. Ethan and a few friends wheeled in a circle, tossing the ball back and forth. He shot from the arc, the ball flying in a smooth arc, clanging the rim before rolling into the net. The kids slapped palms. On the concrete bleachers, Michael leaned back, hands clasped loosely on his knees. He didn't cheer, only smiled, the kind of smile that spread slowly from cheekbones to the corners of the eyes, steady and long. The sun slipped from the court's edge, leaving behind a soft warmth like a thin blanket. Sarah folded up chairs, Grace draped a jacket over Ethan's shoulders, Linda gathered the balls. Michael stood, waved his son over. "Let's head home, kiddo." Ethan turned back, lifted the ball like a wave of farewell. In his eyes, the evening light broke into golden fragments, free of any sharp edge. That night, closing the door, Michael paused at the photo on the shelf. The woman's smile in the glass no longer stabbed him. It steadied him, like a handrail on safe steps. He switched off the lights, leaving only the glow of a basketball-shaped night lamp on the desk. Sometimes justice isn't only about punishing wrong, but about giving fragile souls a chance to be loved and to live again. On another Sunday afternoon, light rain drizzled. After basketball practice, Ethan dozed on the sofa, small hands still scented faintly of rubber from the ball. Michael tucked a thin blanket over him, then sat beside, quietly watching the damp hair stuck to his boy's forehead. For the first time in many months, the child's sleeping face was unknotted, slack as if it finally trusted this place to be safe. Michael rose softly, stepped onto the porch. Sarah was watering the rose bushes, Grace sorting donation files. Linda from the center had stopped by, bringing a stack of picture books for the kids. No one said much, only the sound of water and the soft chirring of insects lay beneath it all. "It feels strange," Michael began, eyes on the trembling rose trellis. "It's been so long since I heard the boy laugh without my chest tightening." Sarah rested her hand on the shovel handle, answered slowly, "Kids know fear, but they also know how to come back. What matters is if someone will stand beside them all the way." Silence stretched a moment. Michael remembered his wife's letter, the words shaky but firm, "Never let our son believe he is a burden." Those words cut into him, yet also lit the path. He knew then all the effort, every time he'd swallowed his anger, every paper, every piece of evidence. None of it was for revenge. It was only to keep that promise whole. Grace gently laid the stack of papers on the wooden table, her voice trembling but steady. "People may gossip, they may doubt, but there's one thing no one can deny. Love. It shows in the way your son looks at you, in the fact that he's willing to pick up the ball again. That is the real evidence." Michael nodded, his throat tight. He realized some battles aren't won with words or power, but with patience and persistence, staying silent when needed, standing firm when needed, and being gentle when needed. Just the way he had to learn all over again to be a father from the start. A little later, Ethan woke, his eyes still heavy with sleep. He wheeled himself onto the porch, looked at the three adults, then asked, "Can I water the plants?" Michael blinked in surprise, then broke into a laugh. He handed his son the small watering can, reminding him, "Easy now, no need to force it." The water trickled onto the leaves, each drop catching the evening light like a tiny spark. Ethan watched the roses tremble, then whispered, "I feel kind of like these flowers. I have thorns, but I can still bloom." All three adults froze for a beat. Sarah turned her face away to dab her eyes. Grace laid a hand on her grandson's shoulder, her voice thick. "That's right, child. And that's the most precious thing." Michael looked at his son, a steady conviction rising in him. If a child once smothered by fear could still compare himself to a flower that dares to bloom, then it meant healing had begun. And the duty of him, of every adult, was simply to shield that tender shoot from storms, so it could grow in the light. Night fell, the house filled with the scent of hot tea and fresh-baked bread. Ethan sat coloring over an old drawing. The window flung wide, a deep blue sky, and a full round sun. Michael stood behind him, saying nothing. He knew not every wound closes at once. But today, at least, the boy had dared to draw the sky again. Outside, the rain had stopped. The wind chimes sang softly, light and clear, reminding him that some sounds aren't meant to frighten, but to soothe. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, whispered just loud enough for himself. "We've come this far, and we'll keep going. We won't give up on each other." In that small room, a father and his son quietly learned how to begin again, day by day, step by step. And that, more than anything, was the truest justice life could offer. That night, after his first practice at the center, Ethan lay in his room, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Before, whenever he closed his eyes, he would hear again the shouting, the crashes of things being thrown, even the sting of sunlight burning his skin in the backyard. But tonight, the first thing that came to him was the basketball hitting the backboard, dropping with a thump into the hoop, followed by the sound of his friends clapping. A new memory, brighter, had slipped in between the old shadows. He turned his head toward the photo frame on the shelf. It was a picture of his mother, her smile as warm as the morning sun. Ethan whispered, as if she could hear him, "I made the shot, Mom. I don't need my aunt to say good job anymore because Dad smiled at me." Inside, the boy's heart stretched a tangled cord between fear and hope. Fear was all those long days sitting under the sun, sweat running into his ears, the word burden cutting into his chest. Hope was simpler. Just one word of praise, one hand resting on his shoulder. Tonight, that hope had come true. And for the first time, he felt he wasn't alone. Ethan remembered how, back at the gym, Sarah and Grace had stood behind the glass railing, giving him a thumbs up. Linda had run over with a water bottle, saying, "Good job, kid." He realized then that the world wasn't only made of people who scared him. Out there were still many who wanted to see him stand tall. He closed his eyes and listened to the sound of his dad making rounds, checking the doors, each lock clicking firmly into place. Every sound was like a promise. No one will hurt you anymore. Ethan pulled the blanket up to his chest and let out a quiet breath. The next morning, when sunlight streamed through the window, he picked up his crayons and opened the notebook he'd left unfinished. This time, he didn't draw closed windows anymore. He drew a basketball court with a hoop, and himself in a sports wheelchair, with his dad standing beside him. The lines were still clumsy, but to him, it was the most beautiful drawing he had ever made. When his father walked by, he paused to look. Ethan grew nervous. Would Dad think it looked bad? But Michael laid a hand on his son's shoulder and said simply, "It's beautiful. This drawing is truly beautiful." Just one sentence, yet it was enough to replace 1,000 excuses. That afternoon, Grace told an old story, how Ethan's mother had loved roses because they have thorns but still bloom. Ethan sat listening, and suddenly remembered the words he had once blurted out. He smiled. Maybe he, too, could bloom in the way of the roses. That night, Ethan dreamed he was running on strong legs. But unlike before, this time he didn't wake up in tears. He simply touched the rim of his wheelchair's tire and whispered, "I'll learn to run in another way, and I won't be ashamed anymore." That lesson, Ethan drew for himself. People don't have just one way to move forward. What matters is that whether on feet, on wheels, or by any other means, you can still go on so long as someone believes in you, waiting at the end of the road. In the living room, Michael sat with the new foundation files in his lap, his eyes heavy from too many sleepless nights. But in the bedroom, the child he loved most had begun learning to believe he was worthy, and that was the greatest gift life could ever return. Ethan buried his face in the pillow, his lips shaping words only he could hear. "I'm not a burden anymore. I'm Dad's hope." Outside the window, the wind chime rang softly, blending with the gentle night. A new chapter in the boy's life had truly begun. The story of Michael and Ethan is not only about a father protecting his son from shouting and abuse, but also about the journey of giving the boy back his right to be safe, to be loved, and to believe he is not a burden. Sometimes, to save a fragile soul, it doesn't take great strength, just a timely embrace, a protective glance, and the resolve never to let go. No one is born knowing how to be another person's anchor, but perhaps what truly matters is not how strong we are, but whether we turn away when we see a child trembling, searching for something to hold on to. What do you think of Michael's choice that day? If it were you, would you step toward the child, open your arms, or walk past in silence? And if you or someone you know ever feels like a burden, remember this: in a true home, no one is a burden. Everyone deserves to be loved and protected. I'm here, listening, truly.